Imagine you're a pilot. High over the frozen skies of Germany in 1943, you're flying the biggest, heaviest, and most powerful single-engine fighter plane the world has ever seen. But to the enemy, you're a joke. They laugh at you. They call your plane a Juggernaut. But not as a compliment. They call it the flying bathtub. A clumsy, overweight pig that has no place in a sky ruled by their sleek, deadly birds of prey. They are the aces of the German Luftwaffe, the most experienced and feared pilots in the world, and they believe you are easy prey. But what if the joke was on them? What if the very things they laughed at, its size, its weight, were its secret weapons? This is the story of a turning point, a single day in history, June 26, 1943, that revealed the terrifying truth. This is the story of how American engineers and a handful of brave pilots taught the world how to turn a flying bathtub into a Luftwaffe nightmare. To understand the story of the Thunderbolt, you first have to understand the crisis. By early 1943, America was throwing its full industrial might into the air war over Europe. The strategy was simple and brutal. Send massive waves of B-17 flying fortress bombers deep into Germany to destroy their war machine. There was just one problem. The bombers were dying. They were called flying fortresses, armed with 13 heavy machine guns. It was believed they could defend themselves, but this was a myth. Once they crossed the coast, beyond the range of their fighter escorts like the British Spitfire, they were alone, and the wolves were waiting. The Luftwaffe's finest, the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109. These planes were fast, agile, and armed with explosive cannons. They were flown by pilots who had been fighting for years. They would swarm the bomber formations, attacking from every direction, head-on, from above, from below. And the B-17s, as tough as they were falling from the sky in horrifying numbers. For every bomber that went down, 10 crewmen were lost. The math was unsustainable. America was losing the air war. America needed an escort fighter, a guardian angel that could fly with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way back. The fighters they had at the start of the war just couldn't do it. They didn't have the legs, the fuel, or the performance at high altitude. The air up there, at 25,000 feet, is thin and freezing. An engine needs to breathe oxygen, just like a person. And up there, engines gasped for air, losing power. This is where the challenge lay. The American military needed a plane that could do three things that seemed almost impossible at the time. 1, it needed to fly for a very long time, for hundreds and hundreds of miles. 2, it needed to perform at extreme altitudes where the bombers flew. And 3, it needed to be tough enough and powerful enough to defeat the best fighters Germany had. The solution that arrived at the airfields in England was not what anyone expected. It was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and the first reaction from almost every pilot who saw it was disbelief. Just look at it. Compared to the nimble Spitfire, it was a giant. It weighed over 10,000 pounds empty, and when fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, it could weigh up to 8 tons. That's the weight of 2 elephants. The pilots would walk around it, shaking their heads. They joked that if you ever got into trouble, you could just unbuckle your seatbelt and walk around inside the fuselage. The cockpit was huge and comfortable, like an office, a far cry from the cramped cockpits they were used to. It earned nicknames fast. The Jug, short for Juggernaut. But the Germans had their own names. They called it the Flugzeugbadewanne, the flying bathtub. They saw it lumbering into the air and they laughed. Their own fighters were like sports cars. Light, quick, and agile. The P-47 was a Mack truck. In a classic turning dogfight, the kind of fight that had defined air combat until then, the P-47 was a disaster. It couldn't turn with a 109 or a 190. It couldn't climb as fast from a low altitude. On paper, and in the minds of the German aces, the Thunderbolt was a flying coffin. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The Germans and even many Allied pilots were missing the point. They were judging a book by its cover. The secret to the Thunderbolt wasn't its shape. It was what was inside. It was built around the most powerful aircraft engine of its day, the Pratt Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine that produced a staggering 2,000 horsepower. But horsepower alone wasn't enough. Not at 25,000 feet. The real genius was hidden deep in the belly of the beast. A complex, delicate system of ducts and machinery called a turbo supercharger. Think of it like this. The turbo was a special fan that would collect the hot exhaust gases from the engine and use that energy to spin a turbine at incredible speeds. This turbine would then pump huge amounts of compressed air back into the engine. It was like giving the engine its own oxygen mask. While German fighters started to choke in the thin air above 20,000 feet, the P-47 was just starting to breathe. It was a high-altitude monster. And that wasn't its only secret. When a German pilot got a P-47 in his sights, he was looking at a flying fortress. But when a P-47 pilot got a German in his sights, the German was looking at the apocalypse. Lined up in the wings were 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 4 on each side. The American 50 cal was one of the most reliable and devastating weapons of the war. When the pilot squeezed the trigger, he unleashed a firestorm. Those 8 guns could spit out nearly 100 rounds of ammunition per second. It wasn't a stream of bullets. It was a solid wall of lead. Pilots called it lighting the match. A 1-second burst would send a devastating shotgun blast of heavy slugs into an enemy plane. Unlike German cannons, which carried limited ammunition, the P-47 could carry thousands of rounds. It could fire for nearly 40 seconds straight. A German Fokker-Wulf was made of thin metal skin over a light frame. When this wall of lead hit it, it didn't just make holes, it disintegrated. It came apart in the air. The Germans were used to surgical strikes with their cannons. This was just brutal, overwhelming American firepower. But a great engine and big guns don't automatically make a great fighter. In the spring of 1943, when the first P-47S went into combat, the results were disappointing. And that's putting it mildly. The American pilots were fresh from training. They had been taught to fight in a certain way, a way that worked for lighter planes. They would try to get into turning battles with the Germans. They would try to outmaneuver them. Animated graphic shows a P-47 trying to turn with a smaller FEW-190. The 190 easily gets behind the P-47. Narrator: it was a fatal mistake. The P-47, with its immense weight, simply couldn't do it. A German ace could turn his Messerschmitt or Fokker-Wulf inside the turning circle of a P-47 all day long. The American pilots found themselves helpless, watching as the enemy easily slipped behind them and opened fire. They were sitting ducks. Losses started to mount. Morale plummeted. The pilots, who had already been skeptical of the plane, now started to hate it. They felt like they had been sent to war in a truck to fight a pack of wolves. The letters they wrote home were filled with fear and frustration. The great hope of the bomber crews, the long-range escort that was supposed to save them, seemed to be a total failure. The Germans kept laughing, but one man refused to accept failure. His name was Colonel Hubert Zemke. A tough, no-nonsense professional. Hub Zemke was the commander of the 56th Fighter Group, the first group to take the P-47 into combat. He listened to his pilots' complaints. He knew they were scared, and he knew the plane had serious problems when fought the wrong way, but he also saw its potential. He grounded his pilots. He told them, "We are going to learn how to fly this airplane." Zemke was not just a commander, he was a brilliant tactician. He studied the reports. He flew the P-47 himself, pushing it to its limits. He knew they couldn't fight the German way, so he decided they would have to invent an American way. He gathered his best pilots, men like Robert S. Johnson and Francis Gabby Gabreski. They spent hours in the briefing rooms, drawing diagrams on chalkboards. They spent hours in the air, not over Germany, but over the fields of England, practicing. They were trying to unlock the secrets of the Jug. They were writing a new rulebook for air combat, one that was tailored to their unique heavyweight champion. And then they found it, the key. The one thing the P-47 could do better than any other plane in the sky. It couldn't turn. It couldn't climb well at low altitude. But because of its immense weight and its clean aerodynamic design, it could dive. Oh, it could dive like a stone thrown from a skyscraper. When a P-47 pilot pointed his nose down, the plane would accelerate at a terrifying rate, 500 miles per hour. 600, sometimes even faster, pushing the very limits of what a propeller-driven plane could do. The German fighters, light and built for agility, simply could not keep up. Their wings would be ripped off if they tried. This discovery changed everything. Zemke and his men developed a tactic that would become legendary. Boom and zoom. They would use the P-47's amazing high-altitude engine to climb high above the fight, sometimes miles above. They would wait like a hawk. When they saw an enemy below, they would roll over and dive. A screaming vertical attack. They would have one chance, one high-speed pass to fire those 850 cals. And then they would use that incredible speed to zoom back up into the safety of the high altitudes before the enemy even knew what hit them. This new tactic required a new way of flying. The old tight formations were a death sentence. A pilot needed to be free to hunt, so Zemke adopted a formation the Germans themselves used, the finger four, two pairs of planes flying together. A leader and a wingman whose only job was to protect his leader's tail. This gave them flexibility. It allowed them to support each other, and it turned the sky into a three-dimensional hunting ground. The rules were simple, and they were drilled into every pilot. 1. Never ever get into a turning fight with a 109 or a 190. 2. Always try to keep your altitude advantage. Energy is life. 3. If you get into trouble, dive. Your plane will get you out of it. This was a revolution in American air combat doctrine. They weren't just pilots anymore. They were hunters. The bomber escort missions became their hunting trips. They would fly high above the B-17S, using the bombers as bait. When the German fighters came up to attack the bombers, the 56th Fighter Group would come screaming down from the sun. The joke was over. The learning phase was done. It was time to go to work. In May and early June of 1943, the tide began to turn. The pilots of the 56th, now flying with confidence and a clear strategy, started scoring victories. German pilots, accustomed to easy kills against the clumsy bathtubs, were suddenly being blown out of the sky. They would report being attacked by fighters that moved with impossible speed. A flash in the sun, a deafening roar of machine gun fire, and their wingman would just disappear in a cloud of debris. They couldn't catch the attacker. By the time they recovered from the dive, the P-47 was a tiny speck, climbing back into the sky, ready to strike again. The German radio channels, once filled with laughter, now crackled with panicked warnings. Achtung! Thunderbolt, the name, once a joke, was now a curse. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group became known as Zemke's Wolfpack. They were proving, mission by mission, that their Mack truck could indeed hunt wolves. But the ultimate test of the Thunderbolt's reputation, the day it would be forged from a mere threat into an unkillable legend, was fast approaching. And it would fall on the shoulders of a young pilot who was about to have the worst day of his life. His name was Robert S. Johnson. Growing up in Oklahoma, he was a natural. He loved flying, and he was good at it. When the war broke out, he joined the Army Air Forces to become a fighter pilot. Like so many other young American men, he was assigned to the 56th Fighter Group, arriving in England in early 1943. Right when the P-47 was still considered a failure. Like the others, he was initially skeptical. He found the plane difficult to handle, heavy on the controls. He struggled during his first few missions. He saw friends get shot down. The reality of war was a brutal shock. He wasn't a natural-born ace. He was just a determined kid from Oklahoma trying to survive, flying a plane that many believed was a death trap. But he was a quick study. He listened to Hub Zemke. He practiced the new tactics relentlessly. He learned to trust the Jug. He learned to use its strengths, its dive speed, its firepower, its high-altitude performance. He started to see that the plane, if flown correctly, was a truly formidable weapon. He was about to find out just how tough his weapon really was. June 26, 1943. The mission for the day was a bomber escort. The target was near Villers-Coublay, an industrial area outside of Paris, France. For the bomber crews, this was another nerve-wracking trip into hell. For the fighter pilots of the 56th, it was another day at the office. The weather was clear. Perfect hunting weather. Robert Johnson climbed into his P-47, which he had nicknamed Half Pint. He was flying as a wingman in his flight group. His job was to cover his element leader. The pre-flight checks were normal. The roar of nearly 50 double Wasp engines starting up filled the air. One by one, the heavyweight fighters lumbered down the runway and clawed their way into the sky. As they crossed the English Channel and flew over occupied France, the tension mounted. Every pilot scanned the skies, their heads on a swivel, looking for the tiny black dots that would quickly grow into enemy fighters. So far, the flight was quiet. Almost too quiet. The German Luftwaffe had been strangely absent. The bombers reached their target and dropped their payloads. The mission was going smoothly. It was on the way home that the trap was sprung. As the formation turned for home, the German fighters appeared. And they appeared in force. It was a perfectly executed ambush. Focke-Wulf 190S from one of Germany's most elite fighter wings, WW2. These were not rookies. These were the best of the best. The sky, which had been empty moments before, erupted into a chaotic, swirling dogfight. Radio channels were jammed with frantic calls. Bandits at 6 o'clock high. Break left, break. It was every pilot for himself. Johnson stuck to his leader, trying to cover his tail as they dove into the fight. He saw a Focke-Wulf latch onto the tail of another P-47. Following his training, Johnson rolled his plane and dove after it. He lined up the German fighter in his sights. He pressed the trigger. For a brief second, the 850 cals roared, sending a stream of tracers into the enemy plane. It exploded. It was Johnson's first confirmed kill, but there was no time to celebrate. In the chaos of the fight, he had made a critical error. He had lost sight of his squadron. He was alone. Being alone in a sky full of enemy fighters is a pilot's worst nightmare. Johnson knew he was in serious trouble. He tried to locate friendly aircraft, but all he could see were the black crosses of the Luftwaffe. He firewalled his throttle, trying to use his speed to escape the hornet's nest. Suddenly, his plane was rocked by a series of violent explosions. Sound of loud cannon strikes hitting metal. The cockpit filled with smoke. His instrument panel shattered. A 20mm cannon shell had ripped through his fuselage, severing hydraulic lines and setting the plane on fire. Another shell tore into his right wing. He looked back and saw him, a single Focke-Wulf 190, perfectly positioned on his tail, pouring cannon and machine gun fire into his aircraft. Johnson jammed the stick forward, putting the Thunderbolt into a violent dive, just as he had been taught. He was hoping to use the P-47's legendary diving speed to escape, but his attacker was skilled. The German ace stayed with him, matching his every move, relentlessly hammering his airplane. The half-pint was being torn to shreds. The damage was catastrophic. More cannon shells struck home. One ripped through the floor of the cockpit, another slammed into the engine, which miraculously kept running. The control stick went limp in his hands as the hydraulic fluid bled out. The fire in the fuselage grew worse, and the cockpit filled with blinding, choking smoke. Johnson was now flying a wreck, a flaming piece of junk that was barely holding together. He knew he should bail out. Standard procedure was to abandon a burning aircraft immediately, but his parachute had been shredded by one of the cannon shells. Jumping was not an option. He was trapped. He was convinced he was about to die, thousands of feet above enemy territory. He kept diving, desperately trying to shake the German pilot. But the Focke-Wulf was still there. It was like a pit bull that refused to let go. Johnson could see the tracers flying past his head. He could feel the impacts of hundreds of machine gun bullets riddling his plane from nose to tail. The noise was deafening. The terror was absolute. He was just waiting for the final fatal blow. The German pilot on his tail was no ordinary pilot. He was Hauptmann Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, a centurion with over 100 confirmed victories. Meyer was an expert, and he could not believe what he was seeing. He had hit this American fighter with everything he had. He had poured dozens of 20mm cannon shells and hundreds of machine gun rounds into it. He had seen pieces fly off. He had seen it catch fire. By all the rules of air combat, the P-47 should have exploded or fallen apart long ago. Any other plane, a Spitfire, a Mustang, even his own Focke-Wulf, would have been reduced to a cloud of confetti. But this thing, this flying bathtub, refused to die. It absorbed the punishment like some kind of armored beast. It was still flying. Meyer squeezed his trigger one last time. Nothing happened. He was out of ammunition. He had emptied his entire arsenal into this single American plane. In a moment that would become legendary, Egon Meyer pulled his Focke-Wulf alongside Robert Johnson's shattered Thunderbolt. For a few seconds, the two mortal enemies flew side by side, less than 50 feet apart. Johnson, dazed and wounded, looked over and saw the German ace clearly. Meyer looked back at the American plane. He stared at the huge gaping holes, the shredded tail, the smoke pouring from the fuselage. He looked at the American pilot, still alive in the cockpit, and then He shook his head as if in total disbelief. He had done his job. This plane was a flying ghost. It was doomed. Satisfied that his victim would soon crash, Egan Mayer gave a slight, almost respectful salute, peeled his FW-190 away, and headed for home. He would report the kill, confident that no plane could survive that amount of damage. He had just witnessed the impossible. He had just come face to face with the true secret of the P-47 Thunderbolt. It wasn't just a fighter. It was a survivor. Robert Johnson was alone again, but he was alive. The immediate threat was gone, but his battle for survival was far from over. His plane was a wreck. The fire was still burning. He had no hydraulics, meaning he was trying to fly a nearly 8-ton aircraft with pure muscle power, wrestling with the controls. The cockpit was open to the sky. The canopy had been blown away, and a 300-mile-per-hour wind was tearing at him. His vision was blurred by oil splattered all over his windscreen. He was losing altitude, getting dangerously low over enemy territory. Every instinct told him it was hopeless. The plane was dying, but then a flicker of hope. Through the smoke he saw that the fire, which had been fed by a hydraulic fluid leak, was starting to burn itself out. The mighty double Wasp engine, despite being damaged, was still pulling. That engine and the sheer rugged construction of the airframe around him was keeping him in the air. He made a decision. He was not going to die over France. He was going to try to make it home. He was going to show them what this flying bathtub could do. The journey back to England was a nightmare. He was flying just above the treetops, hoping to avoid any more German fighters and ground fire. Every gust of wind threatened to flip the crippled plane over. The controls were heavy and unresponsive. It took all of his strength just to keep the wings level. He crossed the French coast and saw the grey, welcoming waters of the English Channel. This was the most dangerous part of the trip. If his engine quit now, he would have to ditch in the freezing water, and his chances of survival would be slim. He talked to the plane. He pleaded with the engine. Just keep going, just a little further. Get me home. He was losing blood from shrapnel wounds. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but he flew on. After what felt like an eternity, he saw the white cliffs of Dover. He was back in friendly territory, but his ordeal wasn't over. He still had to land this thing, and he had no idea if his landing gear would even work. As he approached his home base at Manston, he tried to lower his landing gear. Nothing happened. The hydraulic system was completely gone. He was going to have to make a belly landing. A belly landing in a normal plane is dangerous enough. A belly landing in a plane loaded with fuel, with a damaged engine and no controls, was suicidal. He radioed the tower, his voice strained. Mayday, mayday. This is Half Pint. I'm coming in. I have no hydraulics, no flaps. I'm going to have to belly it in. On the ground, emergency crews scrambled. Fire trucks and ambulances raced to the side of the runway. The other pilots of the 56th had already landed. They had reported Johnson as missing in action, presumed killed. Now they stood in stunned silence, watching this ghost of an airplane descend from the sky. It looked like something from a junkyard. It was riddled with holes. The tail was a skeleton of twisted metal. They couldn't believe it was still flying. Johnson lined it up with the grass field next to the runway, cut the engine, and hoped for the best. The P-47 hit the ground with a sickening crunch. It slid for hundreds of feet, tearing up the earth, a shower of sparks and dirt flying in its wake. The ground crews and pilots held their breath, waiting for the explosion that seemed inevitable, but it never came. The plane finally skidded to a halt. For a moment, there was silence. Then the emergency crews were racing towards the wreck. They expected to find a dead pilot, but then the shattered remains of the cockpit canopy were pushed aside, and Robert Johnson, covered in oil and blood, pulled himself out and slid down the wing. He had made it. He was home. Hub Zemke ran up to the plane, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked at Johnson, then he looked at the plane. He walked around it slowly, touching the jagged holes. He just kept shaking his head. He had known the P-47 was tough, but this was something else. This was impossible. The ground crews began the official damage assessment. The numbers were staggering. They counted 21 holes from 20mm cannon shells. These were explosive shells designed to blow airplanes apart. They stopped counting the machine gun bullet holes when they passed 200. The tail section was almost completely severed. The rudder was gone. The main wing spar, the bone that held the wing together, had been hit. The engine had taken multiple hits. The propeller was damaged. The hydraulic, electrical, and oxygen systems were completely destroyed. The plane was a total write-off. It would never fly again, but it had done its job. It had absorbed a level of punishment that should have destroyed 10 airplanes. And it had brought its pilot home. The story of what happened to Robert Johnson and his P-47 half-pint on June 26, 1943, spread like wildfire, first through the 56th Fighter Group, then through the entire 8th Air Force, and eventually through the ranks of the Luftwaffe itself. For the American pilots, the story was a massive morale boost. Their skepticism about the P-47 vanished overnight. They had proof. They were flying the toughest damn fighter plane in the world. If Johnson could survive that, they could survive anything. They started calling the Jug the flying foxhole. It was a plane that could take you into hell and bring you back. Their trust in the machine was now absolute. For the Germans, the story was a terrifying confirmation of what they were beginning to suspect. This was not a clumsy bathtub. This was an armored monster. The reports from aces like Egon Meyer were clear. You had to kill a Thunderbolt on the first pass. You had to hit the cockpit or the engine and make it count, because if you didn't, it might just survive your attack, and its 850 caliber machine guns would make sure you didn't get a second chance. The laughter stopped. The mockery turned to grudging respect, and then to outright fear. The psychological balance of the air war had shifted. One single airplane, on one single day, had changed the P-47's reputation forever. It was no longer the joke of the skies. It was now the nightmare, and the numbers proved it. As the pilots of the 56th and other P-47 groups perfected their tactics, confident in the survivability of their planes, their victory scores soared. Robert Johnson, the young pilot who almost died on June 26th, went on to become the first American ace in Europe to break Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. He ended the war with 27 confirmed aerial victories. Hub Zemke's Wolfpack, the 56th Fighter Group, became the top-scoring fighter group of the 8th Air Force. They destroyed over 1,000 enemy aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once the ugly duckling of the American fighter fleet, had become one of its most effective killers. It was still a heavyweight. It still couldn't turn with a 109, but that no longer mattered. The American pilots weren't playing the Germans' game anymore. They were playing their own. A game of speed, power, and unbelievable toughness. A game they were now winning. The story of Robert Johnson's survival is a story of a pilot's courage, but it's also a story of incredible engineering. To truly understand how the flying bathtub became a nightmare, we have to look deeper under the skin. We have to understand the machine itself. And it all starts with the heart of the beast. The animation zooms in on the massive radial engine at the front of the plane. Narrator: this is the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. Think of it as the heart of a heavyweight champion. It was an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine. Now that term, air-cooled, is incredibly important. German fighters, like the Messerschmitt 109, used liquid-cooled engines, just like a car. They were powerful, but vulnerable. One lucky bullet, one piece of shrapnel puncturing a coolant line, and the engine would overheat and seize in minutes. The Double Wasp was different. It was cooled by the air flowing over its cylinders. It had no fragile radiator, no vulnerable coolant lines. It was a brute. Stories from pilots were common of landing with one or even two cylinders completely shot off. The engine still chugging along, pulling them home. It was this raw, reliable power that kept Robert Johnson in the sky when all hope seemed lost. But power on the ground is one thing. The real battle was fought 5 miles up, in the thin, freezing air where the bombers flew. And this is where the P-47's second secret weapon came into play, its turbo supercharger. We mentioned it earlier, but its design is what made the Thunderbolt so unique and so huge. Most planes had their superchargers bolted directly to the engine, but the P-47's turbo was a massive, complex piece of machinery. It was too big to fit in the engine compartment, so the designers put it in the tail of the airplane. This required a breathtakingly complex system of pipes. Hot exhaust gas from the engine was piped all the way to the back of the plane to spin the turbo. Then the newly compressed air was piped all the way back to the front to feed the engine. This intricate plumbing is what gave the P-47 its deep, barrel-chested fuselage. It's the very reason it looked like a bathtub, but it allowed the engine to breathe, and to thrive at altitudes where German fighters were gasping for air. It was a trade-off. A bigger plane for total dominance at high altitude. An engine can keep you flying, but it can't stop a bullet from finding you. The designers at Republic Aviation knew this, and American military doctrine was clear: protect the pilot. The P-47 was built accordingly. It was, in essence, a flying bunker. The pilot sat in an armored bathtub of his own. A thick plate of steel was placed behind his head and back, capable of stopping cannon shells. The windscreen in front of him wasn't just plexiglass, it was thick, bulletproof glass. Even the engine itself acted as a massive shield, protecting the cockpit from head-on attacks. This dedication to safety was a core part of the plane's design. It was heavy because it was tough. It was tough because it was meant to bring its pilot home. While other nations might build their fighters to be as light and fast as possible, the P-47 was built with the assumption that it was going to get shot, and it was designed to win that fight. Even after the enemy had landed their best punches, this philosophy of survivability was something the Luftwaffe aces had never encountered on this scale before. But the best defense is an overwhelming offense. We've talked about the 850 caliber machine guns, but the genius was in how they were used. The guns were angled slightly inward, so the streams of bullets would cross at a specific point out in front of the plane, usually around 300 yards. This created a cone of fire that converged into a zone of absolute destruction. A German pilot flying into this zone wasn't just being hit by one or two bullets. He was flying into a buzzsaw. Furthermore, the P-47 carried a massive amount of ammunition for these guns, typically around 425 rounds per gun. That's 3,400 rounds in total. A German pilot might have enough cannon ammunition for 5 or 6 short bursts. A Thunderbolt pilot could hold down the trigger for nearly 40 seconds. This firepower was terrifying. It didn't just damage enemy planes, it shredded them. It caused catastrophic structural failure. It was the ultimate expression of American industrial might, translated into battlefield dominance. So what was it actually like to sit inside this beast? For the pilots, the experience was unique. The cockpit was, by the standards of the day, enormous. Pilots joked it was like an office. There was room to stretch, room to move. This comfort was a serious advantage on long, grueling 6-hour escort missions. In the air, it was known for being stable. Pilots said that in a dive it felt like it was on rails. It was a solid, dependable gun platform. It wasn't a nimble sports car, but it was a muscle car. It felt powerful. It felt safe. And after the story of Robert Johnson spread, that feeling of safety turned into a feeling of invincibility. Pilots developed an intense loyalty to the Jug. They knew it had its flaws, but they also knew it was the toughest thing in the sky. It gave them the confidence to be aggressive, to take risks, knowing their plane could take a beating and still get them home. That psychological edge cannot be measured, but it was a decisive factor in the air war. As the P-47 was proving its worth, another legendary American fighter was arriving in England. It was sleek, beautiful, and had a secret weapon of its own. It was the North American P-51 Mustang. Initially, the Mustang was a good, but not great airplane. But when British engineers fitted it with their legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire, it was transformed into a thoroughbred. The P-51 was fast, agile, and most importantly, with its advanced design and drop tanks, it had incredible range. By 1944, the P-51 could fly with the bombers not just to Paris but all the way to Berlin and back. It was a true long-range escort, the plane that would ultimately break the back of the Luftwaffe's fighter force. For a moment, it seemed like the P-47's time in the spotlight might be over. The heavyweight champion was being challenged by a younger, faster contender. The two planes were a study in contrasts. The Mustang was the fencer's foil, light, fast, and precise. It was the ultimate high-altitude dogfighter. The Thunderbolt was the broadsword, heavy, rugged, and devastatingly powerful. While a P-51 might be the better choice for a classic turning dogfight at 30,000 feet, it couldn't match the P-47 in two key areas. First was the Thunderbolt's incredible roll rate. It could snap into a turn or a dive with astonishing speed. And second was that legendary toughness. The P-51, with its liquid-cooled engine, was more vulnerable to battle damage. It was a magnificent plane, but it wasn't a flying foxhole. So as the P-51S increasingly took on the very long-range escort missions, The US Army Air Forces had a decision to make. What do you do with thousands of battle-proven, heavyweight fighters that are the toughest things in the sky? The answer would change the war on the ground. The Thunderbolt's story wasn't ending. In fact, its most important chapter was just beginning. The P-47 had another name, given to it by the ground crews who had to load it: the 7-ton pickup truck. This was because of its incredible ability to carry weight. Its strong wings and powerful engine meant it could be loaded up with a staggering amount of ordnance. Pilots could attach 500-pound bombs under each wing. They could carry batteries of high-velocity rockets. They could even carry napalm tanks. When fully loaded for a ground attack mission, a P-47 could carry a bomb load of 2,500 pounds. To put that in perspective, that's more than half the bomb load of a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber from earlier in the war. The Germans had a word for this type of aircraft: Jabbo, a short form of Jagd bomber or fighter bomber. The P-47, with its firepower, its bomb-carrying capacity, and its legendary toughness, was about to become the most feared Jabbo of the entire war. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the skies above were swarming with fighters, and leading the charge were the P-47 Thunderbolts. Their mission was to act as aerial artillery for the soldiers on the ground. They flew at low altitude, a terrifyingly dangerous job that exposed them to intense anti-aircraft fire from the ground. But this is where the P-47's toughness paid off. They could absorb incredible amounts of flak and keep flying. They strafed German gun positions with their 50 cals. They dropped bombs on bunkers and strongpoints. They hunted for German tanks and reinforcements trying to get to the beaches. For the soldiers pinned down on the sand, the sight of a P-47 roaring overhead, guns blazing, was a beautiful thing. It was their guardian angel with a sledgehammer. On D-Day alone, P-47 groups flew hundreds of sorties, playing a critical, if often unsung, role in the success of the invasion. After the breakout from Normandy, as the Allied armies pushed across France, the P-47E were let off the leash. Their primary targets became the German supply lines, and the most vital part of that supply line was the railway system. The mission was called train busting. Groups of P-47s would fly at treetop level, following railway lines, hunting for German trains carrying troops, tanks, and supplies to the front. This was arguably the most dangerous job a pilot could have. At that low altitude, you were a target for everything the enemy had, from machine guns to rifles. But the P-47 pilots were relentless. When they found a train, they would unleash hell. A single pass with those 850 caliber machine guns could rip a locomotive's boiler to shreds, causing a massive explosion. They would then circle back to destroy the rest of the train, car by car. They crippled the German ability to resupply their army. They were strangling the enemy, one train at a time. In the brutal winter of 1944, Hitler launched his last desperate gamble in the West. The Battle of the Bulge, a massive German armored assault, crashed through the American lines in the Ardennes forest. For the first few days of the battle, the weather was horrible. Thick clouds and fog kept the Allied air forces grounded. On the ground, American troops were surrounded, outnumbered, and fighting for their lives. The German panzer divisions seemed unstoppable. But the American soldiers held on, praying for one thing: a break in the weather. Then, just before Christmas, the skies cleared, and the Jabbos were unleashed. Hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts took to the air. Their hunting ground was the network of roads that the German tanks were using. For the German tank crews, who had enjoyed total freedom of movement, the sky suddenly became their worst enemy. The Thunderbolts were coming. The P-47s came down at treetop level, their 50 cals ripping into the thin top armor of the German tanks. They fired high-velocity rockets that could penetrate even the thickest armor of a Tiger or Panther tank. They dropped bombs that turned convoys of trucks and half-tracks into flaming wreckage. The roads became a graveyard of twisted metal. The German offensive, which relied on speed and surprise, literally ground to a halt. They couldn't move during the day without being spotted and destroyed from the air. German soldiers started calling the P-47 der Tausend Nadel Teufel, the Thousand-Needle Devil, because of the sheer volume of bullets it could spray across a target. The defense of Bastogne is legendary, but it was the P-47s flying in support of the ground troops that truly broke the back of the German attack. They had once again proven that the flying bathtub was the ground soldier's best friend and the enemy's worst nightmare. The Thunderbolt's reputation for toughness and firepower made it a popular aircraft not just with American forces. It was supplied to many other Allied nations under the Lend-Lease program. The British Royal Air Force flew them in the jungles of Burma, where its ruggedness was essential. The Free French Air Force flew them in the liberation of their own country. Even the Soviet Air Force used them, though they preferred more agile fighters for their style of combat. But perhaps the most famous international users were the pilots of the Brazilian 1st Fighter Group and Mexico's Escuadron 201. These pilots fought with distinction in Italy and the Pacific, respectively, proving the Thunderbolt was a weapon that could be effectively used by any determined pilot. It was a truly global warhorse, a symbol of American industrial production that was shared with its allies to help achieve a common victory. Its simple, rugged design meant it could be maintained in difficult conditions, far from major workshops, making it an ideal export fighter. While the P-47 earned most of its fame in the skies over Europe, it also played a significant, if less celebrated, role in the war against Japan. The vast distances of the Pacific theater made it a challenging environment for fighters. Early versions of the Jug didn't have the range required. However, later models, particularly the P-47N, were specifically designed for the Pacific. They had longer wings that could hold more fuel and a more powerful engine. This gave them the legs to escort B-29 Superfortress bombers on some of their missions against the Japanese mainland. In the Pacific, its opponent was different. The Japanese Zero was incredibly agile, even more so than the German fighters, but it was also extremely fragile. When the 850 cals of a Thunderbolt connected with a Zero, the results were even more spectacular than in Europe. The Japanese plane would simply disintegrate. The Jug's boom and zoom tactics and its sheer toughness proved to be just as effective in the Pacific as they were over Germany. As the war in Europe drew to a close in the spring of 1945, the P-47s were dominant. The once mighty Luftwaffe had been shattered. The new German jet fighters, like the Me-262, were technologically superior, but they were too few and too late to make a difference. And even they were not immune to the Thunderbolt. Several P-47 pilots became jet aces, using the Jug's incredible diving speed to ambush the jets as they were taking off or landing. In the final days of the war, the Thunderbolts roamed over Germany at will, attacking anything that moved. They had started the war as the unloved, oversized protectors of the bombers. They ended the war as the masters of the battlefield, the undisputed kings of ground attack. The journey was complete. The pilots who had once feared and mocked the plane now spoke of it with a deep affection and respect. It was the plane that had always brought them home. It was the Jug, and it was a legend. When the war ended, the age of the propeller-driven fighter was already over. The jet age had begun. The thousands of P-47s that had served so valiantly were now obsolete. Many were scrapped, their aluminum melted down to help rebuild the world they had fought to save. Others were sold to smaller air forces around the world, where some would serve for another decade. For the American military, the future was with jets like the P-80 Shooting Star, the Thunderbolt, the Mustang, the Corsair. These titans of the Second World War were quickly retired. Their job was done, but the legacy they left behind was more than just their incredible combat record. The P-47 in particular had taught the American military a valuable lesson. It proved that sometimes the best solution isn't the most elegant one. Sometimes brute force, toughness, and sheer, overwhelming power are exactly what is needed to win a war. It was a philosophy that would define American military hardware for generations to come. But we must never forget the cost. This story of a triumphant machine is also a story of immense human sacrifice. For every pilot like Robert Johnson who survived against all odds, there were thousands of others who did not. They were young men, most of them in their early 20s, from every corner of the United States. They flew into combat day after day, knowing that their chances of completing a full tour of duty were slim. They flew a tough airplane, but there is no such thing as an indestructible airplane, and there is no such thing as an invincible pilot. They fought and died in the freezing skies over Germany, in the jungles of the Pacific, and in the fields of France. Their courage, their skill, and their sacrifice are the true story behind the legend of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The machine was incredible, but it was the men who flew it who were the real heroes. A legend is forged by many hands. It took the vision of a brilliant designer, Alexander Kartveli, who dreamed of a high-altitude fighter built around the most powerful engine and turbocharger he could find. It took the leadership of a brilliant tactician, Colonel Hub Zemke, who refused to give up on the plane and who taught his men how to turn its weaknesses into strengths. And it took the bravery of thousands of pilots like Robert S. Johnson, who flew the plane into combat, who faced down their fears, and who, through their own incredible experiences, proved to the world just what the flying bathtub was capable of. It was this combination of innovative design, tactical genius, and unbelievable courage that created the legend. Today, only a handful of P-47 Thunderbolts are still flying. They are lovingly restored and maintained by enthusiasts, a living tribute to the men and machines that fought for freedom over 75 years ago. To see one fly today is to witness living history. The sound of that double Wasp engine is unmistakable. It's not the high-pitched whine of a Merlin engine. It's a deep, throaty, rumbling roar. It is the sound of power. When you see its size, its sheer bulk, you can finally understand why the German aces laughed. And when you hear that roar and imagine the sound of 850 caliber machine guns joining in, you can understand why they stopped. So how do you turn a flying bathtub into a nightmare? First, you build it around the most powerful engine of its day, and you give it a revolutionary turbo supercharger that allows it to dominate the high altitudes where the battle is won. Second, you arm it with an overwhelming amount of firepower, enough to ensure that anything it hits stays hit. Third, you build it tough. You build it like a flying tank, with armor to protect the pilot and a rugged airframe that can absorb unbelievable amounts of damage and still come home. And finally, and most importantly, you give it to pilots who are smart enough to learn its secrets and brave enough to use them. Pilots who understand that you don't fight the enemy's fight, you make them fight yours. You make them fight in the vertical, a world of speed and power where you are the king.